So let's just jump straight in. You have a really unique profile, Patrick. You're a commentator and an interpreter. What has been your proudest interpreting moment so far?
And I did a game in Milan between Atalanta, the team in Bergamo, and Manchester City in last season's Champions League. And I had Pep Guardiola, the Manchester City manager, who had spent 3 years during his playing career playing in Italy. So he played for Roma for a season and Brescia for 2 years. So Brescia being the rivals of Atalanta, so there was a bit of a subplot there. And what was great about that was his Italian is actually pretty good. So he was able to answer questions both in Italian when they were put to him by Italian journalists, and then obviously in English from the English journalists. I was working by actively, and that certainly kept me on my toes. But it's great because I think I did a good performance, and he appreciated it. And the proud moment really emerged at the end of the press conference when he turned to me and said, "Sei un fenomeno. You're a legend," I suppose is the equivalent of that. And I like that because it wasn't just my own representation or my own perception of how the event had gone. That was sort of tangible feedback from the man I'd just been interpreting in front of. I think the cameras have been switched off by then, but there are a few people still lingering in the press conference room.
So what's your proudest commentating moment?
I think the breakthrough for me came when someone in London heard me doing a game on that international feed and then offered me work in London on international football as a result of that. And that's when I started to think, okay, this is good because I'm not in London and yet I can still compete with those that are in London. And so that was a breakthrough. So it wasn't necessarily a match, a goal, or a moment. I mean, since then I've done a couple of cup finals and super cups and things like that, and there have been some memorable goals, and occasionally, you know, you stop and think to yourself, oh, I like the way I commentated on that goal. But I think for me it was more, again, similar to the interpreting side of things. Is there any objective feedback? Is it positive? And what's the sort of tangible moment that I can grasp hold of? So I think it was probably that, as opposed to saying, oh, it was when Christian Eriksen scored a 96th minute free kick winner in the Milan derby in the quarter-final this year, for instance.
It's really interesting because a lot of people look for these moments, but it's interesting that you seem very journey-centred. Is that something that's always been there, or did you grow up, wanting the big goals and the big moments and the big events?
I think it probably is a journey. It's not something I'd necessarily considered. I think that's a great question. I think it's more a case of you have to look back over the milestones as opposed to stopping then and there and thinking, okay, I've really made a breakthrough now. It's more when you stop to think, oh, look how far I've come, as opposed to, because often these opportunities come along like London buses. You feel like, okay, I've done nothing for 2 years, and then suddenly 3 things have followed one after another. So I do think it's something you need to just commit your entire career to. I said to a friend and colleague recently, I said, I think the biggest impediment, the biggest hurdle to us making a lasting impression and having a successful career as football commentators is simply dropping out of the industry, not having the patience, basically. I said, as long as you keep interpreting, excuse me, as long as you or I keep commentating and make sure that you consistently do it, unless you're bad or unless you hit a ceiling, then like any career, you are going to naturally progress. And by virtue of that, you should reach X or Y level. So I think it is a very long process, and occasionally you lose sight of that. I was so impatient. I'm an impatient person by nature, but I was very impatient at the start of my career. And you do compare and contrast. Oh, he's doing this, I'm only doing this. Oh, I'm doing this, whereas he's doing that. And so I think you need to try, where possible, and focus on what you're doing, how your career is developing, what the sort of the progress has been. It's never going to be linear, and you do find that there are a lot of these peaks and troughs. So I think, yeah, once you embrace the notion that it's not simply going to be this moment and you have this big career break, I don't think that happens anymore. So I think the way to make progress and the way to have a successful career is to simply just find that consistency and do it time and time again to a good standard over many years.
Now, I want to swerve slightly, because one of the things that I try to do on this channel is try to introduce people who maybe haven't used interpreting before, or maybe are using interpreting but are struggling. I know quite a few clients, I've come across quite a few clients who get frustrated that interpreting isn't delivering what they want it to deliver. So what tips would you give to maybe football clubs or broadcasters who are trying to get the best from interpreting but seem to be hitting hurdles?
I think you need to understand what it is we do, which is not always particularly evident. I think there's a lot of impatience I've noticed in the media, particularly from journalists, and there's a natural distrust of interpreters working in football in particular. Now, I don't know, it's the whole chicken and the egg situation. I don't know if that has come about because, unfortunately, they have been exposed to a lot of bad performance. So journalists are naturally wary. I think it's difficult, the whole notion of it, because journalists typically work on quotes, you know, especially if you're interviewing someone in a language that you're able to speak, you can simply have direct quotes, shorthand. You need to educate the media as to what it is interpreters do, the challenges we face. But equally, I think you also need to educate interpreters as to what it is the coach and the player wants when they're speaking, what the press officer wants, because there are so many vested interests here, and ultimately what the media want. If I want to come up with a headline, if I need to find an angle on this storyline from a press conference, which can often be, for want of a better word, to use the French expression, langue de bois, you know, they're just trotting out platitudes, then it can be very difficult to actually necessarily extract something of value from that. So I think it comes down to what is it everyone is trying to do? What is everyone trying to achieve, and getting everyone on the same page? But there's so many cooks involved in the process. I think that's where the issue lies.
The way that you've been speaking about this and seeing all the people involved, how did you get here? You know, how did you become an interpreter and a commentator?
Very good question. I wanted to be a commentator first and foremost. I think it was an idea that came to mind when I was probably about 14 or 15. You know, I played football to a very average standard, but I was constantly talking. You couldn't shut me up. I remember there was a specific incident, and my friends still rib me about it to this day, that I was playing a tennis match against a friend at school just sort of after hours, and we decided to play a 5-set match, which is never a good idea. Especially when you're not sort of playing in a Grand Slam. I mean, no one really wants to endure that agony. But I was 2 sets down. This guy was patently a better tennis player than me. I'm ultra competitive. I'm a terrible sport. And I decided that I was going to start commentating on us playing against one another as of the 3rd set. Needless to say, I secured a stunning comeback, won the 5-set match. But I think it was disgraceful sportsmanship, a really poor form. You know, the irony is when you actually do tennis commentary, I did a bit of that at the start of my career, is tennis commentary, you can talk at all times apart from during the rally. In English, you are silent during the rally, you let the pictures speak for themselves, and then you might try and add something as and when the rally is over. So for me to not only commentate during the rally, but to commentate so that my opponent could then hear me was just ludicrous. But I try and use that story. I try and put a positive spin on it to say that's clear evidence of what a commentary nut I was. But then it became a case of how do you break into this industry? And so when I was 14, 15, we're talking about the turn of the new millennium, and there was just no information out there whatsoever. So it was a case of how do I get into this? I don't really want to do media studies. I think there are now courses on broadcast journalism. There might even be courses on football commentary or sports commentary in general. But the only thing I was good at school was French. I did a degree at UCL in French and Italian. I decided to start Italian from scratch, and that was probably a good thing in hindsight, given where my career's gone. Did the usual undergrad degree, did a couple of training courses with the BBC in partnership with the RNIB, which was then the Royal National Institute of the Blind. I think it's now for blind people. Anyway, the acronym still applies. And they had come up with a scheme to improve inclusivity in stadiums. They had become aware that there are a number of blind and partially sighted football goers that weren't happy with the coverage that they were getting, maybe because local radio were cutting away to provide updates on other games, or there were ad breaks. So it was audio description as opposed to pure radio commentary. And so I trained a bit with that, but there was never an opportunity. They were trying to link up volunteer commentators with football clubs. I was based in London at that time. There was never an opportunity. A couple of near misses. It wasn't until I came back to do a master's in conference interpreting that I decided, right, I'm back in England. I'd spent the intervening 2 years away. I'd lived in the south of Italy for a year and the south of France for a year. It wasn't until I came back from those 2 years away to study in England, I said, right, I'm going to be in England for a year. I'm going to have one last crack at this commentary lark, and if it doesn't go to plan, then I'll shelve those plans completely. I started doing a bit of hospital radio for Bristol City, and 3 months later, I started actually doing commentary in London on a watch and bet service. So a lot of leagues from all around the world, and it was people going on to betting websites, and they had done research that essentially showed that the more that the greater access people have to the match, if they can hear and see what's going on, the more inclined they are to bet and spend money. So there was a market to provide commentary for that, and there's a little pop-up screen in the thing, in the corner. And I started doing commentary, believe it or not, it makes me cringe when I think about it now, in French and Italian, all the while studying as a conference interpreter at Bath. And for those not familiar with Bath, they typically try and train conference interpreters for the institutions. So the notion that I would be doing broadcasting in French and Italian sort of really contrasted heavily with what I was being told day to day, week to week. So I really tried to grapple with that, and I tried to compartmentalize. And I said to myself, I'm going to study up as much as I can. And I did so much work on glossaries, and I sought the advice of native speakers. I'm still fairly sure the net result was not broadcast standard, but it gave me crucially repetitions as a commentator, and I think that's important stylistically and in terms of technique, regardless of which language you're doing it in. And I always made peace with that. I said, I will do this for as long as someone deems it acceptable for me to do it. As soon as there is a complaint, as soon as someone says to me, this is not for you, in French and Italian in particular, I will stop doing it. But I also recognized, I acknowledged fairly early on that this was not a sustainable career path. So I endeavored to then make the switch to do it in English, which had always been my goal to begin with. And so I always say the irony is I became pigeonholed as a French and Italian commentator in London, albeit at a very low level. And I had to move from London, where I was commentating in Italian, to Italy in order to commentate in English. So make of that what you will.
We've talked about this before, but there are specific types of interpreting assignments. And I noticed on your website, you have picture after picture of you with very well-known football players and managers at press conferences. What does good interpreting look like at a press conference? What do you think all of these cooks are trying to get out of the press conference?
You need to be heard but not seen, if that's possible. I mean, typically press conferences, unless we're talking about the small number of elite football clubs that are in European competition every year, simultaneous interpretation is fairly rare in football interpreting, unless, well, now obviously there's a large move towards remote interpretation, but that's true all across the industry. But if you're there and doing it consecutively, notepad and pen, then I think speed is important. And occasionally I've gone the other way and spoken too fast, and it's almost come out a bit garbled. And I remember reading someone tweeted about my performance once, saying the translator, Sick, has spoken too fast for 90% of the hacks assembled in this room, or something like that. So then I made a note to myself. I thought, okay, be fast. And I think there is a duty to do it slightly more. It's a very difficult one, because on the one hand, I think you should be able to take your time and make sure you're there doing your job to the best of your ability, which means taking your time, reasoning things out, and producing the best possible free-flowing message that you can come up with. However, there is a tendency to almost feel that that's being self-indulgent, in that as far as I'm aware, it's always been my perception, maybe it's just that as soon as you start speaking, the media that understand what you're saying are grateful to have the interpretation. But maybe the local media who don't require English interpretation, if I'm doing a game in Italy, are just very impatiently waiting for the next opportunity to get a question in. So they want that interpretation to be done and dusted as quickly as possible. So you have to strike that balance between serving the foreign media who have come and need your interpretation, but also making sure that you do it in a concise enough way and you don't end up extending the press conference by 100%.
Going on to research, it's a nice little segue, actually. I came across a paper a few years ago. I was at a very large academic conference, and I listened to two academics talk about their study on interpreting at MotoGP and Superbike. I know that's away from where you are, but they've had this interesting finding that they got student interpreters and student journalists to interpret the same interview. And the student journalists were producing output that was better for a press, better for what they were wanting a press conference to do. What is your take on that? And does that tell us something about, how we need to prepare interpreters to work in the field of sports interpreting?
I think it's a very good point. I think it shows that it really comes down to what your background is. If you have a background in sports journalism, then you're much more concerned about how things are presented and how they might necessarily be received. In interpreting, maybe you're more focused on the content and being faithful to the message. And I think it's a case of trying to strike the balance between those two areas. So it's trying to make the sports journalist aware of the fact that meaning and word choice and someone's message really matters. And there's a reason why they've chosen, well, maybe there's not, maybe they're very tired after a race and they come out with something they've been very cautiously media trained over. But on the interpreting side of things, I think we need to also take a bit of a step back and think, okay, we do have a tendency maybe to beat ourselves up over things and be very precious about our own performance. And occasionally it might be a case of thinking, okay, well, what is the message here? How is it that these people tend to speak? What words do they use? And can I find the best equivalent to that to make it very easy to be consumed by viewers at the other end, you see, because that's the whole issue. You have, unfortunately, you have the sports journalists who are experts on the media side of things and the sport, but they are complete laymen when it comes to the interpreting side of things. And you have the interpreters who are laymen when it comes to the sports, unless they happen to specialize in their area, which is, there's no guarantee of that. So I think there probably could be some crossover there, maybe get them working together. But it's a tricky one. And I've found the hardest thing I ever tried to do, and I won't be attempting it anytime again soon. It's interesting you make that point, because I worked for Inter TV for 18 months, Inter Milan's in-house club TV channel. And I had a colleague there who was an Italian sports journalist, very good. His mum's from El Salvador, so he grew up speaking Spanish, and he has a notion of, he speaks good English as well, and has a notion of Portuguese. And what amazed me was we had some Portuguese speaking players at Inter in that time, and he would often interview them post-match. They wouldn't want to speak Italian, but they'd been at the club long enough to be able to understand the questions in Italian. So he wouldn't have to do any active interpretation from that perspective. He would ask the questions in Italian. They would answer in Portuguese. But because he had asked the question himself, because he was so comfortable on air and so at ease with the subject matter, he would then produce these very good interpretations of their answers back into his mother tongue, Italian, and then move on and segue into the next question. And I remember trying to do likewise. We had a couple of people over from Norwich City once, and we had a question each, and I'd just seen him do that. And I found it amazingly difficult to go from the interviewer, so asking a question in English, then interpreting my own question into Italian so it was intelligible for the audience back home, then waiting for the person I was interviewing to answer in English, try and take on board that information, and then interpret it back into Italian before then segueing into another question, all the while processing what had been said in the answer and maybe being able to build on that. And it's funny, Jonathan, because I actually think my interpreting training hindered me in my ability to do that, because I didn't have the crutch of a notepad and pen, and I wasn't approaching it as a journalist, and I wasn't really listening as much to what they were saying as I should have done. And what was interesting, and it was in that study as well that you mentioned, there was less tendency to necessarily follow the order in which things were said. And I think that's a good trick. And I noticed it was a trick maybe that laymen were slightly better at, which is maybe I'll just start with the last thing I've heard, the end of the answer, and then I'll sort of work backwards and I'll try and piece it together. I mean, it's not a faithful rendition from that perspective. So I found that absolutely fascinating, and that's something I'd like to actually practice in my spare time, because I think if you're able to do that, then it's certainly a bonus. But it's not a situation that we as interpreters are used to encountering too often, and it does happen in football interpreting or media interpreting in general, that someone will hand you a handheld microphone And you say, well, what can I do with that? I need one hand for a pen and one hand for a notepad. So I've had it a few times where I've clumsily put down the microphone, boom, that hits the ground, pick up my notepad and pen. It takes forever. Then you're going back trying to find the right page. It's all very clumsy and it doesn't look particularly good. So it doesn't surprise me that sports journalists occasionally, not always, can be a bit more pragmatic and can ultimately, if you're taking it in sort of very rough terms, they might be able to, on occasion, provide a slightly better end product. I'm not necessarily saying it's linguistically better or it's better in terms of content, but in terms of if you were to ask the viewer at home who was the better interpreter, maybe they might actually say the sports journalist.
Well, I think that's an interesting point. I don't like the word quality because I think as interpreters we have a very set idea of what quality is. And I'm becoming more and more aware that what clients ask for and what we deliver aren't always the same thing. And it is making sure that we match up the interpreting that we're delivering with what they want. I remember there was one assignment I had that was on the economics of the lumber industry in Europe. One of these horrific jobs, but I thought at the end of it, I thought it's been 1.5 days of whispered interpreting. My brain hurts. I've had 3 points where I just couldn't interpret because it was too much. I thought I'd done an absolutely awful job, and I was waiting for the clients to basically say, you're never working for us again. But the French delegation came up and were really, really pleased with my work.
Oh, there you go.
And I thought, I knew if my interpreting teacher had been there, she'd have told me, hand in your badge kind of thing. But the clients were telling me how good the job it was. And I thought, there's a mismatch here that it's worth exploring and to try and work out, I love what you were talking about, what the press are after and what the club is after. If we can angle out interpreting at that, perhaps it would help us see that interpreting in sports isn't the same as interpreting for the commission or interpreting. Even I've noticed interpreting a factory tour is very different to interpreting at a big conference. There's a different dynamic that goes on. And to round this off, what advice would you give to people who would like to get into sports interpreting? What stages should they be going through?
I think it's coming back to what I said earlier, where you need to be exposed to the way sport is covered and spoken about in your working languages, first and foremost. I think you need to have an interest in sport, which, the clue is in the question, I think, there. So these people that are approaching sports interpreting, it's probably because they're sports fans first and foremost. I don't think you necessarily approach it for the glamour or anything else, although there is occasionally a glamorous side to it. So I would think be very familiar with the sports in terms of how they work, first and foremost, in terms of the rules or the laws, whatever it may be. Know who the key players are, but make sure that process then extends into your working languages. I mean, there's so much content out there now. I mean, it doesn't have to be football. It could be any sport, but I always, use football as my sort of benchmark. But you could spend 24 hours of a day listening to French podcasts on football. And similarly, you could just watch press conference after press conference on YouTube. And so I think the material is out there, and it's just a case of, for me, I remember when I was doing my master's at Bath, it was towards the end of things, towards the end of the year, and there was so little material to work with out there. But I started doing just 2-minute interviews on the Gazzetta dello Sport website, because maybe there were videos of Sebastian Vettel speaking very bad Italian, and I would then interpret that into English, just because I was trying to get my hands on some sports content. I don't think there's any shortage of that now. And I think for me, the occasional difficulty came during my master's was finding motivation to practice in my spare time. But I think if you are very interested in a certain subject matter, then that practice time just absolutely flies by, because you're doing something you enjoy. So you're combining the sport with the interpreting, and then it's only going to, it's like compound interest. It's only going to sort of snowball from there. And I think you'll be in a much better place as and when you get that first opportunity to perform, and then hopefully impress someone and really kick on from there.
Mm-hmm. And it's amazing how much of interpreting is about getting to know people and sending people that you admire an email and saying, do you know anything about this? I had the honor of having an email recently where someone asked me about something, and I said, well, that's not my specialty, but I happen to know the guy whose specialty it is.
Brilliant. Yeah.
And being able to direct people to the right place is one of the great honors of being an experienced interpreter. So 100%. Patrick, thank you very much.
My pleasure.